I welcome you to the discussion for the Sabbath school lesson. The book of concern is the book of Exodus. The title is The Background and the Birth of Moses. So when we are reading the book of Exodus, we should know that the book of Exodus highlights God's care for the oppressed, offering hope to those who feel abandoned or enslaved today. It shows that God hears the cries of the suffering and takes the initiative to rescue them. The message of Exodus is one of the redemption, deliverance, and the salvation fulfilled in Jesus Christ. By studying this book, we are reminded to trust God in life's struggles, knowing He is present, compassionate, and leading toward the eternal promised land. On Sunday, the subtitle is saying God's people in Egypt. We will focus on Exodus chapter 1, verse 1 to 7, and also Exodus chapter 1, verse 8 to 11. To begin with Exodus chapter 1, verse 1 to 7, we will focus on chapter 1, verse 7. The Bible records, "But the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, multiplied and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them." So now, the book of Exodus chapter 1, verse 1 begins, or it highlights a small group of people, which are about 70, which is the family of Jacob, which came into the land of Egypt. So it reveals a powerful truth about God's faithfulness in blessings. Though Jacob's family entered Egypt as a small group of 70 people, God caused them to flourish and multiply greatly. This shows that even in the fallen land, God's promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were being fulfilled. When we read Exodus chapter 1, verse 8 to 11, the summary here is the change of what is in Exodus chapter 1, verse 1 to 7. So, what is happening here is that a new Pharaoh arose who did not know Joseph and saw the Israelites' growth as a threat. As a result, he enslaved them and subjected them to harsh labor, building cities. Now, despite this oppression, God's people continued to grow, showing that divine blessings cannot be stopped by human cruelty. Now, what is the lesson that is here? So, lessons on not taking God's circumstances for granted. So, here there is a shift. In chapter 1, verse 1 to 7, it is showing the growth of the Israelites. Again, in starting verse 8 to 11, there is a shift here. The Israelites are now being enslaved by the new Pharaoh who knew no more, who knew nothing about Joseph. So, what can we learn from the two passages? So, the shift from favor to oppression in Egypt teaches us that good circumstances can change suddenly. The Israelites, once honored because of Joseph, were later enslaved when leadership changed. We must remember to place our trust not in worldly comfort or positions, but in God who remains unchanging and sovereign through all circumstances. Okay, now on Monday, the subtitle is saying historical background, the historical background. So here, I'm just giving the summary of what is on Monday. So now, when Jacob and his family moved to Egypt due to famine, that is according to Genesis chapter 46, they were welcomed because of Joseph's high position in Pharaoh's court. Joseph had risen from being sold into slavery by his brothers when we read Genesis chapter 37, verse 26 to 28, to becoming second in command in Egypt. So now, his success came not from circumstances, but from God's presence and favor. So, despite what Joseph was going through when he was sold in Egypt, at the end, because of the favor of the Lord, Joseph became victorious and he was second in command in Egypt. So now, the Lord was with Joseph and he was a successive man. And our main text on Monday is Genesis chapter 39, verse 2. Now, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and he gave him favor. The divine favor was the key to the rise of Joseph despite betrayal and imprisonment. Now, over time, a new Pharaoh arose who did not know Joseph, right? And the name of this Pharaoh was Hamos. Hamos 1. That's the name of this new Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. This marked a shift from favor to oppression. Successive rulers, including Amenhotep I, Thutmose I, increasingly persecuted the Israelites, and a lot of Israelites were killed. Now, what happened here is that due to the increase in number of the Israelites, these successive rulers or the pharaohs of Egypt, they thought that no, if these Israelites, if we keep these Israelites in increasing numbers, at one point they may turn around us, they may turn against us. Eventually, Moses was adopted. as a result, Moses was adopted by the Pharaoh's daughter, believed to be Hitspat. Now, the Exodus led by Moses likely occurred around 1450 BC during the reign of Pharaoh Thutmose III. Now, despite the long years of slavery and suffering, God never abandoned his people. Now, the sojourning of the children of Israel who lived in Egypt was 430 years, and all the armies of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. This narrative from Genesis through Exodus reveals God's faithfulness, presence, and redemptive power. Reminds us that even in trials, God remains sovereign and near. We may not understand everything now, but we can fully trust in God's plan. Tuesday, the Hebrew midwives. We are reading through Exodus chapter 1, verse 9 to 21. So the summary which is here is that as the Israelites grew in number, Pharaoh feared they might become a threat. He commanded the Hebrew midwives to kill all newborn Hebrew boys. However, Shiphrah and Puah, the two midwives, refused to obey this wicked command because they feared God more than Pharaoh. That is when we read in Exodus chapter 1, verse 17. Now, despite the immense power Pharaoh held, as one considered a god in Egypt, he could not override the conscience and courage of these faithful women. Now, in contrast to the unnamed pharaohs, the midwives are honored by name in scripture for their moral conviction and faithfulness. As a reward, God blessed them with their families of their own. That is when we read Exodus chapter 1, verse 20 to 21. So, what is the key lesson here? So, like the midwives, we are called to stand for what is right, even when when pressured by authorities. As Peter said, we ought to obey God rather than men. That is in Acts chapter 5, verse 29. What's the encouragement here? We should call up. The Lord is telling us that we should call upon Him. That is when you read Psalms 50, verse 15. It says, "Call upon me in the day of trouble, and I will deliver you, and you shall glorify me." What is on Wednesday? So on Wednesday, we are trying to give this the story of on the birth of Moses. So when you read Exodus chapter 2, verse 1 to 10, the short summary is that Moses was born under a decree. So we should read Exodus chapter 2, verse 1 to 10. So what is here is that Moses was born under a death decree, but was preserved by God's providence and protection. His mother hid him, and through God's plan, Pharaoh's daughter adopted him after finding him in a basket on the river Nile. Now, his name was Moses, which simply means drawn out. Now, his name drawn out, it was more like a reflection, it was a reflection of what Moses will do when he becomes a leader. So, this Egyptian princess named him as Moses, which means drawn out, because she drew him out of the water. Now, this name was not only about how he was saved, it pointed to his future. Just as he was drawn out of the Nile, Moses would one day draw Israel out of Egypt. His name was a sign of his mission. Now, though raised in Egyptian loyalty and educated to be a future Pharaoh, God had a greater plan to use Moses to lead Israel out of slavery. Now, despite his royal training, it was God's truth, not Egyptians' wisdom, that would try prepare him for his mission. Now, the key verse is Exodus chapter 2, verse 24, which is our memory text. The next subtitle is a change of plans. A change of plans. When we read Exodus chapter 2, verse 1 to 25, what is happening here? So what happened is that at one point, Moses killed an Egyptian man because that Egyptian man was fighting with an Hebrew man. Now, what Moses did made the Pharaoh, who was at that time, to be very furious and angry of what he did. Now, his life changed drastically when he killed an Egyptian who was beating a Hebrew. Now, the whole matter of Moses killing the Egyptian was quickly made known to the Egyptians and greatly exaggerated, soon reached the ears of Pharaoh. It was represented to the king that his act meant much, that Moses designed to raid his people against the Egyptians, to overthrow the government and to seat himself upon the throne, that there could be no security for the kingdom while he lived. So now, it was at once determined by the monarch that he should die because of what he did. But becoming aware of his danger, Moses made his escape and fled toward Arabia. He went to Midian. That is where he spent most of his life. So, what Moses did, it ended like what Moses did, and the reaction of Pharaoh ended Moses' loyal life and future as a possible Egyptian ruler. Now, instead of becoming a god in Egypt, or instead of him becoming the Pharaoh in Egypt, Moses began a new humble life, eventually serving the true God. He act, his act of defending a Hebrew through impulsive showed his heart for his people. But it also revealed that God's deliverance would come not by human strength, but by leading, divine leading. So Moses lived 120 years. Now his life can be divided into three parts. The first 40 years, when Moses was in Egypt as the next Pharaoh, and he was regarded to be the prince in Egypt. The next 40 years, Moses spent it in Midian, and the last 40 years, that is when he became the leader of Israel. That is when he became the leader of Israel. So what's the lesson here? God can use unexpected failures and detours to prepare us for greater purposes. To summarize the lesson in on further thought, when we read one of the comments done by Ellen White, she emphasizes that Satan was behind Pharaoh's command to kill Hebrew male babies, hoping to stop the birth of a deliverer for Israel. However, the Hebrew midwives feared God and courageously disobeyed the king. Though Satan rose this fallen world, God overrose. Jesus defeated Satan through his life, death, and resurrection. And Satan's final destruction is Satan. So the overall message is one of the hope. Even in times of oppression and evil, God's purpose will prevail. So through His grace, we can overcome life's trials. As we read Philippians chapter 4, verse 13, it says, "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me." Thank you so much for